Hey, I'm Naomi and welcome to Nerf This, your one-stop roundup of all of the Tier 2 Korean Overwatch scene news. Now, week 2 was deemed an off week due to some leaked scrimmage, so what better time than to drop a first impressions take on the 10 teams taking part in our first season of 2021. We've had 4 official games in week 1 and a couple of experimental games to tide us over this week, so that's plenty of material to get our first impressions on these new teams, new orgs, and in some cases, new coaches. Let's dive in. WGS is the reigning champ, having taken the crown in 2020 Season 2, but they jumped into 2021 with a completely new lineup, like right down to 0 players and staff and not making any announcements to the last possible moment. So it seems like they're committed to keeping things exciting this season, at least. Their first match was against Chinese region champions Team CC, who were also fielding a bunch of new players. This matchup of new kids in big shoes seemed to work out for WGS at the start as they took Lijiang, but they fell short for the rest of the match, ultimately losing 3-1. It's super clear that this is a team of talented players with team teething issues. There were some standout performances like Polapo really shining on Brigitte and Vulture on DPS going to town on Anubis, but it's all going to come down to whether they can come together and find that team synergy to avoid needless mistakes they consistently made. It's a tough one to call because the only fixture left from WGS's grand win last year is their head coach, Pico. He's working with both a new assistant coach and a new squad, so I guess it all comes down to whether he can turn both of these out. Team CC is one of our new arrivals to the Korean scene, fresh off of China region dominance, but with some new and familiar faces playing this year. I think a lot of us are really eager to see whether this will unfold to be the blessed Fusion Uni trajectory that was promised, or the cursed Fusion Uni trajectory that eventually tumbled on out. So CC came into this with a largely new roster. There are only 2 holdovers from last year, Spectra on DPS and support player Super Rich, who is playing under the tag Hao Yokyun. Straight out of the gate against WGS, it did not look great. Lijiang was a little chaotic, but they managed to snap out of it, and it became pretty clear that the team gel might not quite be set yet, but their individual skills may just be unrivaled. Their tank line had a really good showing against WGS, and they did give us a glimpse of the kind of power we can expect from them when they get a little more used to playing together. They had a really impressive stall on Gibraltar Point B that drained about 50 seconds off of an inevitable cap, so if they can keep making plays like that, then they're definitely a team to watch. Everyone's favourite boys in pink are back, with some new pickups as Mag and Assassin were signed up to Washington during the off-season. Of course, the new roster is typical Runaway fare, bringing strong player-driven storylines at the ready and that patented underdog narrative set out before them. This is going to be a really risky season for Runaway. Let's call it up front. They're fielding the tournament minimum 6-man roster, with a 15-year-old ball main on main tank. Now, on paper, this should be a disaster, but there's something about Runaway that just works. Somehow, inexplicably. They're a team that makes it happen against all odds and have been throughout the org's storied history. Their first game of the season started off shaky with a poor show on Lijiang, but then it just happened. They made it work. Donghak made it work on Winston. Ado, who has his own redemption arc ahead of him after a rough go in the league, he popped off. He became that playmaker he once promised, and they really quite dominated Gen.G for the remaining 3 maps. This is a weird setup, it's a weird roster, but the staff behind the scenes here have always managed to do a good job putting together a cohesive team, without fail. So you know what? They might just pull it off this year, ball main and all. What's a Runway season without a hefty hurdle and a sprinkle of anxiety-inducing self-doubt? So, Gen.G, Gen.G. Gen.G is much of the same. You know, the sun rises, the sun sets, Stalker is still on DPS. The org is really invested in calling up players from their secondary and tertiary teams to play. It is interesting that they didn't call up Izhan after his gauntlet performance last year, but here we are. Gen.G as a team has always been solid, but other than the gauntlet, they've always been solidly mid-pack. Contenders Korea is a scene full of teams reaching high peaks and pretty devastating lows, but Gen.G has never really had either, or a major breakthrough. You know, as Pixie said, they're not even the bridesmaid, they're the bridal party. So coming into 2021 saw them take on Runaway first, and it may be early days to call this, but given that this is a first impressions video, I'll just say it. It looks to be much of the same. They played against a Runaway who were pretty limited this year, borderline handicapped, some may even argue. But Gen.G still struggled. They were full held on Numbani and Anubis and granted just 1 point on Gibraltar. I don't know what this year holds for Gen.G. I imagine they'll do okay, avoid relegation, but as for that elusive breakthrough, Probably not. Let's be honest, nobody came into 2021 checking for Team BM. If Gen.G is the bridal party, BM is that wedding guest that doesn't even make the photo. They're fielding the same team from last year, but with 3 potentially major changes: a new coach, and former London Spitfire DPS players Babel and Illicit. And also a new support in Bunjo, but again, no one was checking for Bunjo. So I think a lot of people had written off week 1's O2 versus BM match as an inevitable stomp, but it was actually a lot closer than the 3-1 scoreline would lead you to believe. As expected, all eyes are on their new DPS line. Babel and Illicit put on a super impressive display in their match against O2, managing to swing fights that by all means they should have lost. And at the beginning, Bunjo, shocker enough, was doing a decent job turning around fights he likely should have been out of, particularly on Lijiang. But time wore on and the adrenaline ran out. This is a team that is pretty unbalanced, with a very clear win condition, keeping their DPS line alive. The cracks show, with Bunjo regularly taken out of the start of fights, and ultimately the individual level of the other teammates just isn't there. Is this a team capable of taking the title? No. But this is a team that might be capable of making some upsets. If they get it together and keep Babel and Illicit alive long enough for them to pull off what they're capable of, they could definitely catch out some teams that are sleeping on them. O2 Blast is an org that's well established and well seasoned. This year they've added Spitfires, Allo and Sanguinar, mixed with some new faces on their tank line alongside mainstays like Proper, the hyped Contenders Korea player on the edge of being snapped up to the Overwatch League as he turns of age. But Proper wasn't looking like that player straight out of the gate. He struggled with a lot of early deaths on Lijiang and got out-tracered by a player no one even had on their radar. But he woke up after halftime and played the kind of game expected of him. He destroyed on Nepal, displaying masterful mechanics by surviving a deadeye via duplicate frames. If he keeps that kind of play up, then the team is laughing. In truth, if the whole team continues to play like they played on that Nepal map, then they'll prove to be a really tough opponent to take down. This roster has all the potential to match their 2020 Season 1 Contenders win, but you know how it is with Contenders Korea. It's never as simple as a one-team race. T1 is another completely new roster, but all of their players have been around the board, with experience with London Spitfire, Element Mystic and X6 under their collective belt, as well as new coaching from former Contenders champion and Toronto Defiant support, Roki. They may have been the only team to come out of week 1 with a clean 3-0 victory, but it was not a perfect showing. As is the case with most of these new rosters, there were some questionable team plays on display in their first game. There were some iffy dives from Balestria on Winston, and they definitely struggled to coordinate their way out of Gibraltar, but ultimately, like Team CC, T1's individual skill is just undeniable. It was likely boosted due to their opponents, but MN3's Tracer is beast, and of all the new support lines, Unique and Krillin seem to be the most synergized. When I said before it's not as simple as O2 fulfilling their potential to take the title, it's because teams like T1 are out there. Contenders for the crown? Most definitely. But they're not untouchable. Team Diamond is a weaker entrant into the tournament this year, and I don't think a lot of people paid them much mind other than the fact that Miro is making his coaching debut with them. They may not have gotten any maps in their first game, but their performance wasn't a complete write-off. There were glimmers of hope when Gurio was unable to play Sniper, drawing out what looked like a pending speedy loss on Gibraltar. But solo heroics couldn't outweigh some really questionable team plays, like a late 4 out of 6 comp swap defending point B. Also, Inhyuk and Silvercoin have been around the block, and it's never been a particularly successful jaunt for either of them. So whether this is a tank line that can provide a stable enough core for Diamond to succeed remains to be seen. Again, it's early days, very, very early days, but this is a first impressions and they're all about big statements. So it's looking like a very uphill struggle for Team Diamond this season. So Starlight is another of our new orgs who have come to the table prepared and with plenty spares. They are one of the 2 teams that we are yet to see play as a whole, though we did get a sneak peek of their DPS Haim in the experimental games on Thursday night. On the whole, the roster is a mixed bag. There are new faces, and the ones that are familiar have been around the block on a bunch of middling teams. They seem to be lacking that clutch factor on DPS. They don't have a Proper, an Ado, or even a Babel and Illicit. Haim is a former Gen.G/Air, and Tacker contributed nothing of particular note on T1 last year. I predict they'll likely be fighting their way out of the bottom spot in Group A. Talon is the other team coming in with a 6-man minimum, and while Runaway went for the risk, Talon has gone for the steady, because this is a solid roster. Again, we haven't seen Talon play as a whole yet, but just the names alone are enough to get hype. Half of this team is the old Element Mystic, with Hisang on DPS and the full tank line Kellen and Attack. On top of that, Churong and Vigilante look like a really promising support line, and Develop did manage to shine on OZ Gaming last year, despite the team's lackluster performance. On paper, this is a team that could take it. A bold prediction, I know, but remember, that's on paper. On paper, Runaway should have flopped last week, but they somehow managed not to. Who knows how this is going to work out for Talon in action, but it looks like it could be really promising. And those are our first impressions. Of course, these are just our opinions, so if you have your own ideas on who's going to take the title of this season, please let us know in the comments below. We can have a good discussion about it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Please be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell down below. We'll be back next week with our regular programming as the tournament will resume and everything will be back to normal. So I'll see you guys then. Bye!